The morning briefing had been routine. Weather clear across the eastern seaboard, light traffic expected, nothing unusual about the day's operations. I'd grabbed coffee and reviewed my flight plan. Standard preparation for what should be a straightforward trip from Boston to Miami with a quick turnaround. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. My first officer was waiting at the gate when I arrived. We'd flown together a few times before. Easy coordination, professional rapport built over previous trips. He mentioned the aircraft had just come out of overnight maintenance. Everything signed off clean, ready for the day's flying. We walked down the jetway together, our flight bags and conversation marking us clearly as crew. Passengers were already boarding, the usual flow of people finding seats and stowing luggage, the organized chaos that preceded every departure. We moved to the side to let them pass, standard courtesy. Near the aircraft entrance, a man in an expensive suit stopped directly in front of me. He was blocking the path, looking me up and down with an expression somewhere between confusion and irritation. My first officer had already stepped past into the aircraft, leaving me facing this passenger alone. The man asked if I was lost, whether I knew this was the crew entrance, if I needed help finding my seat in the cabin. His tone suggested he was being helpful, doing me a favor by redirecting someone who'd clearly made a mistake. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression neutral. Explained I was crew, that I needed to get to the cockpit to start pre-flight procedures. He laughed, short and dismissive, the kind of laugh that said he thought I was joking or confused. Told me the flight attendants boarded earlier, that I should check with the gate agent if I wasn't sure about my assignment. Pointed to the 4 stripes on my shoulders, the captain's insignia clearly visible on my uniform. Said I was the captain, that I'd be flying to Miami today, that I needed him to step aside so I could begin preparations. His expression shifted from amused to skeptical, then to something harder. He scoffed, the sound harsh and contemptuous. Asked if I was even allowed in here, whether this was some kind of publicity stunt, if there was an actual pilot who'd be arriving to fly the plane. Other passengers had stopped now, watching this interaction, their expressions ranging from curious to uncomfortable. My first officer reappeared at the cockpit door, probably wondering where I was. He saw the situation immediately, started to come back to intervene. I shook my head slightly, handled this myself. The passenger noticed my first officer and his expression changed again, this time to something like relief. He called past me to my first officer, asked when the real captain would be arriving, said he needed assurance that a qualified pilot would be flying. My first officer's face went tight with anger, but his voice stayed professional. He stated clearly that I was the captain, that I was fully qualified, that the passenger needed to take his seat immediately. The man looked between us, still not quite believing. Started to say something about safety regulations and passenger rights, about needing verification before trusting his life to someone who clearly wasn't experienced enough for command. I'd heard enough. Told him in a flat, calm voice that he had 2 choices. He could take his seat and allow the flight to depart on schedule, or he could deplane and rebook on a later flight. But his window for making that decision was closing rapidly, and I was done discussing my qualifications with someone who had no authority to question them. He blustered, said I was being aggressive and defensive, that any reasonable pilot would understand his concerns, that this wasn't personal, just logical caution about an unusual situation. The other passengers around him were shifting uncomfortably, some nodding agreement, others looking away. The lead flight attendant appeared, having heard the commotion. She took in the situation quickly and asked the passenger to please take his seat so we could complete boarding. He ignored her, continued addressing me, saying he'd be filing a complaint about this interaction, about being made to feel uncomfortable for asking legitimate questions. I stepped past him into the aircraft, done engaging. His voice followed me, saying something about this proving his point about emotional reactions and lack of professionalism. I walked through the galley toward the cockpit, feeling the weight of passenger eyes watching, judging, wondering if maybe he had a point. The cockpit felt like sanctuary. Closed the door behind me and took a breath, trying to let go of the anger and frustration. My first officer was already in the right seat, his expression sympathetic and angry on my behalf. He started to say something, but I held up a hand. Needed to focus on the pre-flight, not on the passenger's words. We ran through the checklist: battery switches, hydraulic systems, flight controls. The mechanical precision of preparation helped center me, brought focus back to the actual work. This part didn't care about passenger doubt or scoffing questions, just procedures and systems and protocols that worked the same regardless of who operated them. The lead flight attendant came forward. The passenger had finally taken his seat but was still making comments to those around him, still questioning whether this flight was safe with me in command. Several other passengers had expressed concern to flight attendants, influenced by his persistent doubt spreading. Asked if he was being disruptive enough to warrant removal. She said not quite, that he was staying seated and not being overtly aggressive, just continuously questioning and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. I told her to monitor and let me know if it escalated, but that we needed to stay on schedule. Made my PA announcement welcoming everyone aboard, giving the flight time and weather. Kept my voice steady and professional. The practiced skill of sounding confident regardless of underlying frustration. Could almost feel the passengers in the cabin listening differently, evaluating my voice for signs that would confirm or refute the doubting passengers' concerns. We finished the pre-flight and received pushback clearance. The ground crew disconnected and we started moving away from the gate. I began taxiing toward the runway, the familiar weight and response of the aircraft, the routine operation I'd performed thousands of times. Tower cleared us into position. I lined up on the center line and ran through the final checks with my first officer. His voice was professional and supportive, our coordination smooth despite the tension from boarding. Advanced the throttles and felt the acceleration build, the physics taking over. At rotation speed, I pulled back and the nose lifted. The wheels left the ground and we climbed, Boston falling away below. The departure was smooth, textbook procedures, everything exactly as it should be. Gear up, flaps retracted, climb power set, just flying, just doing the job. We leveled off at cruise altitude. I engaged the autopilot and sat back, trying to let the tension drain from my shoulders. My first officer mentioned he'd never seen anything quite that blatant, that level of open skepticism and scoffing disrespect. Said it must be exhausting to deal with regularly. Told him it wasn't regular, but it wasn't rare either. That most flights were fine, most passengers either didn't notice or didn't care, but that there was always someone who couldn't accept it, who needed to voice their doubt, who felt entitled to question and challenge and demand additional verification. He asked how I dealt with it, how I managed to stay professional when confronted with that kind of dismissal. I said compartmentalization mostly, putting it in a box and focusing on the flying, that the work itself was pure and untainted by passenger opinion, that the aircraft didn't care about doubt, just responded to competent inputs. About 40 minutes into the flight, the lead flight attendant returned. The passenger from boarding was at it again, had unbuckled, and was walking the aisle talking to other passengers, asking if they felt safe, if they'd known a woman would be flying, if anyone else was concerned about airline safety standards. He wasn't being loud or aggressive enough to clearly violate regulations, just persistent and insidious, planting seeds of doubt wherever he could. Several passengers had told him to sit down and be quiet, but others seemed to be listening, seemed unsure whether his concerns had merit. My first officer said this was interfering with crew duties, creating a disturbance that warranted formal warning at minimum. I agreed, told the lead flight attendant to give him one clear warning that any continued disruption would result in law enforcement meeting the aircraft in Miami. She delivered the warning. He apparently accepted it with feigned innocence, claiming he was just expressing concerns that other passengers shared, that silencing him was suppressing legitimate safety questions. But he did return to his seat and stay there, at least temporarily compliant. The rest of the flight proceeded smoothly from a technical standpoint. Good weather, no traffic delays, systems operating perfectly. But the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. The doubt the passenger had spread lingering even after he'd been forced to stop actively promoting it. We started our descent into Miami about 30 minutes out. I briefed the approach with my first officer, reviewed the weather and runway conditions, coordinated our responsibilities. Everything standard and professional, just doing the job despite the disruption that had colored the entire flight. Flew the approach manually, wanted to feel the aircraft, wanted the direct connection, wanted the proof through performance that words couldn't provide. The approach was stable, on speed, on glide slope, made small corrections for the light crosswind, kept everything precise and controlled. The landing was smooth, one of those touchdowns where the transition from flight to ground is barely perceptible, where the wheels kiss the runway so gently that passengers might not even notice. The kind of landing that demonstrated thousands of hours of practice and skill. My first officer commented on it, said it was beautifully executed. I acknowledged it but felt no particular satisfaction. Good landings were what was expected, what was normal, what should happen every time. The fact that this one might ease passenger concerns didn't change the fundamental unfairness of having to prove capability through perfection. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. We taxied to the gate and completed shutdown. The lead flight attendant came forward and mentioned that several passengers had specifically commented on the smooth landing, that the cabin mood seemed more relaxed now. that people were deplaning with normal energy rather than the worried tension that had persisted through the flight. I stayed in the cockpit while passengers deplaned, standard procedure. Could hear conversations in the jetway, including the doubting passenger's voice still holding forth about his concerns. Could hear him telling someone that one smooth landing didn't prove competency, that he'd still be filing complaints about this experience. 2 airport operations supervisors boarded after the cabin emptied. They'd been notified about the disruption, wanted to hear my account of what had happened, were documenting the incident for their records. I gave them a factual summary. The boarding confrontation. The continued doubt spreading during flight. The formal warning delivered. They took notes and said they'd be speaking with the passenger as well, that his behavior had crossed into disruption, regardless of how he framed his concerns. That expressing worry was one thing, but actively trying to create panic among other passengers was another, that there would likely be consequences for his actions. I gathered my things and deplaned. The passenger was in the jetway with the supervisors, his face red, his gestures emphatic. He was insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd just been expressing legitimate safety concerns, that passengers had a right to question crew qualifications if something seemed irregular. Walked past without engaging, headed into the terminal. Could hear him saying something as I passed. Something about how my reaction proved his point about emotional instability and poor judgment. My first officer walking behind me said something sharp in response, but I kept moving. We had a 45-minute turnaround before the return flight to Boston. Found the crew lounge and sat down, tried to decompress. My first officer got coffee and sat across from me, his expression still angry about what had happened. Said he was going to file his own report about the passenger's behavior, that having witness testimony from crew might strengthen the case. I appreciated his support, but felt exhausted by the whole situation. Not by the flying, which had been straightforward and routine, but by everything around the flying. All the extra emotional labor required to do a job that should have been evaluated purely on performance and competence. My phone showed a message from the chief pilot's office. They'd been notified about the incident by dispatch, wanted to confirm I was okay, offered support if needed. I responded briefly that I was fine, that the flight had operated normally despite the passenger disruption. The return flight had a different crew in the cabin, but the same first officer in the cockpit. Different passengers, too. A fresh start. No one who'd witnessed the morning's confrontation. We boarded without incident, no one questioned my presence or authority, just normal operations. Made my announcement with the same professional calm, gave them the flight time and weather. This time, the passengers just listened, and then went back to their phones or books or conversations. The normalcy was almost jarring after the morning's hostility, a reminder that most flights were like this when passengers weren't actively trying to undermine confidence. The flight to Boston was uneventful. Good weather, smooth air, professional coordination with my first officer. Landed gently, taxied to the gate, completed shutdown. Just another routine operation, the kind that happened thousands of times daily across the industry without incident or drama. Walking through the Boston terminal afterward felt different, though. Every passenger and captain's uniform that I passed seemed to move through the space with an ease I couldn't quite match. No one stopped them. No one questioned their right to be there. No one scoffed at their presence in crew areas. That ease, that unquestioned belonging, was privilege they probably didn't even notice. They just were captains, automatically accepted, their authority assumed rather than constantly challenged. While I was a captain who had to prove it repeatedly, whose right to command was perpetually questioned. Got home that evening and tried to decompress. The actual flying had been fine, both legs operated normally, both landings smooth, but the weight of the morning's confrontation stayed with me, the passenger's scoffing question echoing. "Are you even allowed in here?" Like I'd wandered into a space I had no right to occupy. My phone rang. The chief pilot calling personally, wanting to check in after reading the incident reports. He asked if I was okay, whether I needed any support, said the airline backed me completely, that the passenger's behavior had been unacceptable, that consequences were being pursued. Told him I was fine, that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened and probably wouldn't be the last. He was quiet for a moment, then said it shouldn't happen at all, that captains shouldn't have to deal with passengers questioning their basic right to be in command, that he wished he could change the culture that made these incidents possible. I appreciated the sentiment, but we both knew individual incidents could be addressed while the underlying pattern persisted. That one passenger might face consequences, but countless others would continue to doubt and question and scoff. That my authority would keep being challenged in ways male captains rarely, if ever, experienced. We talked for a few more minutes. He mentioned that similar incidents had been reported by other female captains, that the pattern was documented, that the airline was working on better support systems and clearer protocols for handling passenger challenges to crew authority. Small steps, but real steps. After we hung up, I sat thinking about the door. The cockpit door that had sealed shut after I'd finally gotten past the doubting passenger and entered my workspace. That barrier between the cabin where my authority was questioned and the cockpit where it was simply operational fact. The door sealing had been significant, had marked the boundary between passenger opinion and professional execution, between doubt and demonstration, between being questioned and being allowed to just do the work. Once that door sealed, his scoffing ceased to matter operationally, even if it continued to echo personally. He'd asked if I was even allowed in there, voice dripping with contempt and certainty that I wasn't. And then the door had sealed, locking me inside the space where I absolutely belonged, where my credentials and capability were established facts rather than debatable opinions. That sealed door was answer. Not through argument or explanation, but through simple mechanical fact. It sealed because I was authorized to be on the other side of it, because my credentials granted access, because I was the captain regardless of his opinion about whether that was possible or appropriate. Days passed. More flights, more passengers, more routine operations. Most were completely normal. No one questioned anything. The flying just happened smoothly. But I stayed alert for the next confrontation. The next passenger who'd decide my presence in command required their verification and approval. Received formal notification that the scoffing passenger had been banned from the airline. His behavior during boarding and in flight had violated multiple policies. His attempt to create panic among passengers had crossed clear lines. The ban was permanent, his frequent flyer status revoked. The accountability felt good, but didn't prevent the next incident. A week later, different flight, different passenger, same basic interaction. This time at the aircraft door rather than the jetway. But the same scoffing disbelief, the same demand for verification, the same assumption that I couldn't possibly be qualified for the position I clearly held. And once again, the door sealed behind me, locked me into the cockpit where my authority was simply operational reality, where the scoffing couldn't follow, where the doubt remained outside the barrier, where I could just fly the aircraft without having to constantly defend my right to touch the controls. The pattern became clear. The confrontations would keep happening. The doubt would keep being expressed. The scoffing questions would keep being asked. But the door would keep sealing, would keep marking the boundary between opinion and operation, would keep protecting the space where only capability mattered. I started seeing the door seal differently, not as escape from harassment, but as enforcement of reality. The door sealed because I was authorized to be there, because the airline, the FAA, the training system, the check rides, all the institutional structures that governed aviation had determined I belonged on that side of the door. One passenger's scoffing didn't change that. Couldn't unseal a door that my credentials had opened. Couldn't revoke access that had been properly granted through years of training and evaluation. The door sealed behind me, and their doubt stayed on the other side, operationally irrelevant. This understanding helped. Didn't make the confrontations less frustrating or exhausting, but provided framework for processing them. The moment the door sealed, their opinions ceased to matter in any practical sense. They could doubt all they wanted from their seats in the cabin. On my side of the sealed door, I was simply the captain. Months accumulated into years. More flights, more sealed doors, more evidence that the authorization was real regardless of how many passengers questioned it. The door sealed thousands of times, each sealing a small confirmation that I belonged exactly where I was. Sometimes passengers scoffed. Sometimes they questioned. Sometimes they demanded verification that male captains never had to provide. But always, inevitably, eventually, the door sealed. And on the other side, their voices didn't reach. Their doubt didn't penetrate. Their scoffing couldn't affect the actual work. The sealed door became symbol and reality both. Symbol of the barrier between doubt and demonstration, between question and qualification, between passenger opinion and professional authority. Reality of the physical space where only credentials mattered, where performance was measurable, where capability was constantly proven through successful operations. I kept flying, kept hearing questions about whether I was allowed in certain spaces, kept watching doors seal behind me, locking me into cockpits where the question answered itself, where I was allowed because I was qualified, where the door sealed because my access was legitimate, where scoffing ceased the moment metal met metal. The passenger who'd scoffed in Boston was gone, banned, prevented from flying this airline again. But others would take his place, would ask the same questions, would express the same doubt. The pattern would persist because it was built into assumptions about who belonged in command positions, who was authorized to access certain spaces, who was allowed to touch certain controls. But so would the doors, would keep sealing, would keep marking boundaries, would keep enforcing the reality that authorization existed regardless of individual opinions about it, would keep locking me into spaces where I provably, demonstrably, operationally belonged. Are you even allowed in here? The scoffing question that assumed the answer was no, that assumed my presence was error or stunt or violation of proper order, that assumed I'd wandered into a space meant for others, for real pilots, for people who actually belonged. Then the door sealed shut, behind me, beyond the passenger's reach, separating his doubt from my demonstration, sealing me into the cockpit where the question answered itself through the simple fact of my authorized presence, where being allowed wasn't debatable but established, where the door itself was proof. I was allowed in there. The sealed door confirmed it. Every successful flight proved it. Every smooth landing demonstrated it. Every professional operation established it beyond question, beyond scoffing, beyond the reach of passengers who couldn't accept what the door's sealing made mechanical fact. The door sealed. I flew. The doubt stayed on the other side where it belonged, unable to penetrate the barrier, unable to affect the work, unable to change the reality that I was exactly where I was authorized, qualified, and required to be. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. The cockpit, behind the sealed door, where captains belonged, where I belonged, where the scoffing couldn't reach and the doubt couldn't matter, and the question answered itself through authorized access. Are you even allowed in here? Yes. The sealed door said yes. The successful flight said yes. The thousands of hours said yes. The credentials said yes. The training said yes. The qualification said yes. The only voice saying no was his. One passenger, one doubter, one scoffer, whose opinion ceased to be relevant the moment the door sealed, whose question was answered by the sealing itself, whose doubt remained trapped on the wrong side of a barrier he didn't have credentials to cross. I was allowed. The door sealed. That was all the answer required. That was all the proof needed. That was all the validation that mattered operationally, professionally, actually. The door sealed behind me, and I flew, because I was allowed in there, because I belonged in there, because the sealed door confirmed what the scoffing passenger couldn't accept but couldn't change. I was the captain. The door sealed for captains. Therefore, the door sealed for me. Simple logic. Mechanical reality. Operational fact. The scoffing echoed in memory but not in the cockpit. The doubt lingered in frustration but not in operations. The question remained offensive but also answered. Yes, I was allowed in there. The sealed door proved it. Every time it sealed. Every flight. Every successful operation. Every smooth landing. The door kept sealing. I kept flying. The answer remained yes, regardless of how many times the question was asked, how much scoffing accompanied it, how persistent the doubt became. Yes. Allowed. Qualified. Authorized. Captain. Behind the sealed door where I belonged, where the scoffing couldn't reach, where only capability mattered. The door sealed shut. The doubt stayed outside. And I flew.